You may remember walking into your grandmother's house and hearing it before you saw anything else, that particular sound of a rotary telephone ringing on the kitchen wall. Not the chirp of today's devices, but a real bell, metallic and insistent, cutting through whatever conversation was happening at the dinner table. The phone itself was mounted right there on the wall, usually in some shade of avocado green or harvest gold, with a cord that spiraled down and stretched just far enough that your mother could stand at the stove and talk at the same time, the receiver wedged between her shoulder and ear while she stirred something in a pot. That cord had a life of its own, didn't it? Always twisted, always tangled, and there was something almost meditative about standing there, untwisting it, watching it spin back into its proper coils. The dial itself required commitment. You couldn't just tap. You had to put your finger in the hole, pull it all the way around to the metal stopper, and wait for it to return before you could dial the next number. A phone call took patience. It took time. And if you messed up on the last digit of a 7-digit number, you had to start all over again. The phone hung there in its particular spot, and everyone in the house knew where it was. There was no searching for it, no "where did I leave my phone?" It was on the wall in the kitchen, or maybe in the hallway, and that's where it stayed. Beneath it, or sometimes on a small shelf nearby, sat the phone book, that thick, unwieldy brick of yellow pages and white pages, dropped on your doorstep once a year, whether you wanted it or not. The white pages listed every single person in your town, with their address right there, printed for anyone to see. Privacy wasn't quite the concept it is now. If you needed to call the hardware store or the Chinese restaurant or the dentist, you flipped through those yellow pages, thin as Bible paper, until you found what you needed. The phone book had weight to it, literally and figuratively. It was the internet before the internet, the search engine that sat on a shelf gathering dust until you needed it, and then it was indispensable. Perhaps your family kept the phone books in a drawer in that piece of furniture that dominated so many living rooms, the television cabinet. Not a TV stand, not an entertainment center, but a proper piece of furniture made of real wood, often walnut or dark oak, with doors that closed over the screen when you weren't watching. The television itself was a massive thing, a box within a box, the screen maybe 20 inches if you were lucky, surrounded by all that wooden housing. It was a console, really, something that announced its permanence in the room. You didn't move it around, you didn't mount it on a wall. It sat there like an altar, and the family arranged themselves around it in the evenings. Some of these cabinets had storage on either side, little cupboards where you might keep TV Guide or a deck of cards or your father's reading glasses. The wood smelled like lemon pledge because your mother wiped it down every week, and the screen itself accumulated dust in a way that seemed impossible to prevent. You could write your name in it if you wanted to get in trouble. The television was furniture, but it was also the center of a ritual. You didn't have 100 channels. You had 3, maybe 4 if you counted the one that came in fuzzy. You turned it on and waited for it to warm up, watching that little dot of light appear in the center of the screen and slowly expand outward until the picture resolved itself. And when you turned it off at night, the picture collapsed back into that dot, glowing there in the darkness for a few seconds like a tiny dying star. Your father had his chair, usually positioned at just the right angle, and everyone else found their spots on the couch, which might very well have been covered in thick, crinkly plastic.
Perhaps your family kept the phone books in a drawer in that piece of furniture that dominated so many living rooms, the television cabinet. Not a TV stand, not an entertainment center, but a proper piece of furniture made of real wood, often walnut or dark oak, with doors that closed over the screen when you weren't watching. The television itself was a massive thing, a box within a box, the screen maybe 20 inches if you were lucky, surrounded by all that wooden housing. It was a console, really, something that announced its permanence in the room. You didn't move it around, you didn't mount it on a wall. It sat there like an altar, and the family arranged themselves around it in the evenings. Some of these cabinets had storage on either side, little cupboards where you might keep TV Guide or a deck of cards or your father's reading glasses. The wood smelled like lemon pledge because your mother wiped it down every week, and the screen itself accumulated dust in a way that seemed impossible to prevent. You could write your name in it if you wanted to get in trouble. The television was furniture, but it was also the center of a ritual. You didn't have 100 channels. You had 3, maybe 4 if you counted the one that came in fuzzy. You turned it on and waited for it to warm up, watching that little dot of light appear in the center of the screen and slowly expand outward until the picture resolved itself. And when you turned it off at night, the picture collapsed back into that dot, glowing there in the darkness for a few seconds like a tiny dying star. Your father had his chair, usually positioned at just the right angle, and everyone else found their spots on the couch, which might very well have been covered in thick, crinkly plastic. Those plastic couch covers were everywhere, weren't they? Your grandmother probably had them. They were supposed to protect the upholstery, keep the good furniture good, preserve it for some future that never quite arrived. The plastic was clear or sometimes frosted, fitted over the cushions and tucked in tight, and sitting on it in the summer was a special kind of torture. Your bare legs would stick to it, and when you stood up, you'd peel away with a sound that made everyone laugh. In winter, it was cold and slippery. But the thinking was that someday, when company came, you could take off those covers and reveal the pristine sofa underneath. Except the covers never really came off, did they? The company sat on the plastic too. The whole thing was preserved in a state of permanent protection, saved for an occasion that was perpetually just around the corner.
On the coffee table in front of that plastic-covered couch, there was almost certainly an ashtray, maybe more than one. This was when ashtrays were as common as coasters, because everyone smoked, or at least it seemed that way. Your father smoked, your uncle smoked, the neighbor who came over for coffee smoked. The ashtray might have been glass, heavy and cut with geometric patterns, or it might have been ceramic, maybe shaped like a leaf or painted with some cheerful design that seemed at odds with its purpose. They were everywhere, on end tables, on the kitchen counter, on the back of the toilet. You'd see them overflowing with butts, that distinctive smell of stale smoke and ash, and your mother would empty them into the trash, rinse them out, and put them back. There was no stepping outside to smoke. You smoked at the dinner table, in the living room, in the car with the windows cracked just an inch. The smell worked its way into the curtains, the carpets, the upholstery beneath those plastic covers. It was just part of the air you breathed. The walls of these rooms told their own story. Wallpaper was everywhere, and not the subtle patterns you might see today, but bold, unapologetic designs. Flowers the size of dinner plates, geometric shapes and colors that seemed chosen to vibrate against each other, vertical stripes that made the room feel taller. Your mother probably spent weeks choosing the pattern from those heavy sample books at the hardware store, and then your father spent a weekend cursing while he tried to match the patterns at the seams, brushing paste onto the back of each strip and smoothing it onto the wall with a wide brush. The wallpaper was never meant to be temporary. It was a commitment, and because it was such a production to put up, it stayed up for years, for decades sometimes, long after the pattern had gone out of style, long after everyone was sick of looking at it. You can probably still picture the pattern from your childhood kitchen, can't you? The one you stared at during breakfast, during dinner, during those long afternoons sitting at the table doing homework. In some rooms, instead of wallpaper, there was wood paneling. Not real wood planks, but those sheets of pressed board with a wood-grain veneer, usually in a dark, almost orange-brown tone that was supposed to evoke sophistication and warmth. The paneling ran from floor to ceiling, and it made the room darker, cozier, more den-like. Your father's study might have had it, or the basement family room, or maybe the living room if your parents were really committed to the look. The paneling had a particular smell to it, almost sweet, and when you ran your hand along it, you could feel the slight texture of the fake grain. Sometimes there were grooves running vertically every few inches, and you could trace them with your finger while you were standing there talking on that wall-mounted phone, the cord stretched to its absolute limit. Underfoot, the floors told a different story. Linoleum was the practical choice for kitchens and bathrooms, patterns that mimicked tile or stone, usually in combinations of colors that seemed designed to hide dirt, browns and oranges and avocado greens. The linoleum was smooth and cool under bare feet in summer, and it could be mopped clean in minutes. Some of it had a slight cushion to it, a give when you walked across it, and it would show the indentations from furniture legs, little permanent dimples where the kitchen table had stood for years. In the living room and bedrooms you had carpet, and not just any carpet, thick shag carpet in colors that matched the general aesthetic of the era. That deep earthy orange, that golden harvest yellow, browns and tans, and the occasional brave choice of deep red or forest green. The shag was so thick that you could lose things in it, and vacuuming it was a production that required special attachments and multiple passes. You could rake patterns into it with the vacuum, and it would stay that way until someone walked through and messed it up. Kids would lie on it and feel the fibers between their fingers, or you'd sit on it to watch TV, and it would leave little marks on your skin. In the kitchen, up on the wall, there was a clock, and you could hear it. Not just glance at it when you needed to know the time, but hear it constantly in the background of everything. Tick, tick, tick. It might have been a Sunbeam or a General Electric, a round-faced clock with big numbers and hands that swept around with mechanical precision. Some of them were built into the wall as part of the original kitchen design. Others hung there, powered by a cord plugged into an outlet, and that cord was always too short or too long, looped awkwardly to reach. The ticking was a form of companionship, a reminder that time was moving forward, that dinner needed to be started, that the roast had been in the oven for exactly the right amount of time. You learned to tune it out, the way you tune out the hum of the refrigerator. But the moment it stopped, when the power went out or the battery died, you noticed. The silence was strange. Inside that refrigerator, on the top shelf of the freezer compartment, sat metal ice trays, aluminum usually, with a lever on top that you pulled up to crack the cubes free from their molds. Making ice was a process. You filled the tray with water, careful not to overfill because it would spill on the way to the freezer. You set it on the little wire rack, and you waited. Hours later, when you wanted ice, you had to wrestle with that lever, yanking it up and twisting the tray until the cubes came loose, clattering into a glass or a pitcher. The metal was always cold enough to hurt if you held it too long, and the ice often tasted faintly of whatever else was in the freezer, the frozen peas, the mystery casserole from last month. But it was ice, and it was free, and it was yours. The tray went right back under the faucet to be refilled and frozen again, a cycle that repeated itself every day. Just outside the kitchen door, if you lived in certain neighborhoods, there might have been a small metal box built into the wall or sitting on the porch, a milk box. The milkman would come early in the morning before most people were awake, and he'd leave fresh bottles of milk, the cream risen to the top and sealed under a paper cap. You'd hear the clink of glass bottles being set down, maybe the quiet hum of his truck idling at the curb. Your mother would bring in the bottles and put them in the refrigerator, and you'd shake them to mix the cream back in before pouring. The bottles were heavy, satisfying to hold, and when they were empty, you'd rinse them out and put them back in the box for the milkman to collect. It was a system that worked without you having to think about it. The milk appeared, you used it, the bottles went back. The milkman knew your family by name, knew when you'd be going on vacation, knew to leave an extra bottle when your cousins were visiting. He was part of the neighborhood infrastructure, as reliable as the mail. Speaking of mail, you knew exactly when it arrived every day. Not because you got a notification on a device, but because you heard the mailbox clank, or you saw the mailman walking his route, or you simply knew that it was 2:30 in the afternoon and the mail was always there by 2:30. Your mother might send you out to check, and you'd pull down the little metal door of the mailbox and reach inside, pulling out letters and bills and catalogs, and maybe a postcard from someone on vacation. People wrote letters then, real letters, with pens, on paper, folded into envelopes with stamps. You might have had a specific drawer in the kitchen where your mother kept stationery and stamps, along with a return address stamp or labels with your family name and address pre-printed. Writing a letter was an event. You sat down, you thought about what you wanted to say, you took your time. That same kitchen drawer, or maybe a different one, there were always so many drawers, probably held the sewing kit. Not a full sewing basket, but a small collection of essentials: needles, thread in a few basic colors, a little pair of scissors, maybe some buttons that had come off various garments over the years. Your mother could sew on a button at the kitchen table in 2 minutes flat, threading the needle without even looking, doubling it over, knotting the end, and stitching it down tight. And if something needed more extensive repair, there might have been an actual sewing machine somewhere in the house, a heavy Singer or Kenmore, maybe in the bedroom closet or in a cabinet of its own. These weren't electric machines with 100 different stitches. These were workhorses, machines that could punch through denim and upholstery, machines that your grandmother had used and then passed down. The sound of a sewing machine running was distinctive, that rapid, rhythmic chatter as the needle went up and down, the fabric feeding through under the presser foot.
Somewhere else in the house, possibly in a hallway closet or a linen cabinet, you'd find stacks of towels and sheets, but also tablecloths, cloth napkins, and placemats. These weren't saved for special occasions. They were in regular rotation. Your mother set the table with real cloth napkins for dinner, and after the meal, they went into the laundry. There was an expectation of a certain formality, even on a Tuesday. The tablecloth might have had a pattern, fruit, flowers, something cheerful, and it would get stained over time, but it could be washed and bleached and used again. Paper napkins existed, but they were for picnics and casual lunches, not for dinner when the family was together. On that table, during the meal, the radio might have been playing, not from a device on the counter, but from an actual radio, maybe on a shelf or on top of the refrigerator, the dial glowing warm orange through the little window that showed the stations. AM radio, usually, bringing in music and news and the occasional strange conversation from a talk show. Your father might have had a favorite station, and it stayed on that station, and everyone in the house learned the jingles from the local advertisers. The radio was a presence, a voice in the house, something that made the rooms feel less empty when you were there alone. And because you couldn't choose exactly what played, you heard things you wouldn't have chosen, songs from different eras, news you might not have sought out, voices you came to recognize. The radio was a window to a wider world, but it was a window you couldn't control. You got what they gave you, and you learned to appreciate it. After dinner, someone would clear the table, and your mother would cover the leftovers, not with plastic wrap, though that existed, more often with Tupperware, those containers with their distinctive burping lids that you had to seal just right to get them airtight. There was probably a whole cabinet devoted to Tupperware, a jumbled mess of bowls and lids that never quite matched up when you were looking for one, but somehow there was always a container when you needed it. The Tupperware might have been from a Tupperware party, one of those social gatherings where a neighbor invited all the women from the street over, served coffee and cake, and demonstrated the products. Your mother came home with a new set of mixing bowls, or a lettuce keeper, or one of those celery containers that was supposed to keep celery crisp for weeks. The Tupperware was pastel-colored, soft yellows and blues, and that particular shade of harvest gold that appeared in everything, from the phone to the bathroom fixtures. It was durable. It lasted. You probably still have a piece of it somewhere, cracked and stained, but still functional, still sealing, still holding on to the memory of 1,000 leftovers. The dishes themselves were washed by hand in the sink, because while dishwashers existed, not everyone had one, and even if you did, it was easier to just wash the few dinner plates and forks than to wait until you had a full load. Your mother stood at the sink, her hands in hot, soapy water, and you stood next to her with a dish towel, drying each piece as she handed it over, still dripping. The towels were cotton, flour sack towels sometimes, thin and absorbent, embroidered maybe with the days of the week or a cheerful saying. They hung on a little rack or a hook next to the sink, and they were washed and reused until they were threadbare.
Above the sink there was a window, and through it you could see the backyard. And in that backyard, stretched between two poles or trees, there was probably a clothesline. Not a dryer on a cord, but an actual line, rope or coated wire, with wooden clothespins hanging in a bag nearby. On laundry day, your mother would carry out the wet clothes in a basket and pin 'em up one by one, the sheets and towels and shirts flapping in the breeze. There was an art to it, hanging things in a certain order, using just enough pins, spacing them so they'd dry evenly. The clothes came back inside smelling like fresh air and sunshine, stiff from the wind, and they'd need to be folded right away or they'd wrinkle beyond redemption. The clothesline was practical, but it was also a kind of neighborhood communication. You could tell who was home, who was doing laundry, what kind of week the family was having, all from the clothes hanging in the yard. The backyard itself was a different kind of space than it is now. There might have been a small vegetable garden, tomatoes and beans and maybe some zucchini, a patch of grass that your father mowed every Saturday with a push mower, the kind that didn't have a motor, just sharp blades that spun as you pushed it forward. The grass clippings would spray out to the side, and the smell of cut grass would hang in the air all afternoon. There might have been a swing set, metal poles sunk in concrete with swings that had those hard rubber seats, and a slide that got hot enough in the summer sun to burn the backs of your legs. Kids played outside until the street lights came on, and that was the signal to come home. Your mother didn't text you. She stepped out onto the porch and called your name, her voice carrying across the yards, and you knew you had maybe 5 more minutes before you really had to go in. That porch light was always left on, wasn't it? Not a motion sensor light, but a bulb in a fixture by the front door that your father turned on at dusk and left burning all night. It was a beacon, a way to make the house welcoming, a signal that you were home and everything was all right. It attracted moths and June bugs that would flutter and ping against the glass, and in the morning you'd find them scattered on the doormat, dead or dying, their papery wings still twitching. The porch itself might have had a screen door, a wooden frame with wire mesh that slammed shut with a distinctive bang, the spring pulling it closed no matter how gently you tried to ease it off. The screen door was the first barrier between inside and outside, and on summer evenings you could leave the main door open and let the breeze come through, the screen keeping out the bugs but letting in the sound of crickets and the neighbors talking on their porch across the street. Inside the front door there was probably a small table or shelf where the daily accumulations landed. Keys went there, the mail got sorted there. There might have been a small dish or bowl where your father emptied his pockets every evening, loose change, his pocket knife, a couple of sticks of juicy fruit gum still in the wrapper. That bowl of change was a resource, a place to grab a quarter when you needed it for the payphone or the soda machine, a place where pennies accumulated until someone finally rolled them and took them to the back. The change smelled like metal and hands, and it clinked pleasantly when you stirred your fingers through it.
On the wall nearby, there was probably a mirror and maybe a coat rack or hooks where jackets and hats hung. And almost certainly there was a calendar. Not on a phone, not digital, but a paper calendar, often from the local bank or insurance company, given away free every December. It had a different picture for each month, landscapes maybe, or kittens, or vintage cars, and the dates were big enough to write on. Your mother marked appointments, birthdays, the day the trash was collected, the week your father would be away on business. The calendar was the family's organizing principle, the shared reference point. You checked it to see when the dentist appointment was, when the school play was happening, when your grandmother was coming to visit. It hung on a nail, and the pages were torn off and thrown away at the end of each month, a small ritual of time passing. Elsewhere in the house, probably on a shelf in the living room or bedroom, there were photo albums, not digital files, but actual books with thick pages and little corner holders where you slid in the pictures, or maybe the kind with sticky pages and a clear plastic overlay that never quite stayed stuck. Your family's history was in those albums: holidays, vacations, birthdays, ordinary Sundays in the backyard. The photos were small, 3 inches by 5, or square Polaroids with white borders, and each one represented a moment when someone made the conscious decision to take a picture, to use up one of the limited shots on the roll of film. You didn't take 100 photos of the same thing. You took 1, maybe 2 if it was really important, and then you had to wait. You finished the roll, you took it to the drugstore to be developed, you waited 3 days or a week, and then you picked up the envelope of prints, hoping that they came out, that no one blinked, that the exposure was right. Looking through those albums was a journey through your own life and the lives of people who came before you. Here's your mother as a young woman, her hair styled in a way you've never seen. Here's your father in his army uniform. Here's you as a toddler, sitting on a blanket in the yard, squinting into the sun. Next to the albums, there might have been a set of encyclopedias, a full set if your parents had invested in them, those heavy, hardbound volumes with the world's knowledge printed on thin paper and organized alphabetically. If you needed to know something for a school report, you pulled down the right volume, looked it up in the index, and read what was there. The information was static, fixed on the page, unchanging. It might have been years out of date, but it was authoritative in a way that felt solid. And tucked into the encyclopedias, or on a nearby shelf, there might have been a dictionary, and probably a thesaurus, and maybe an atlas with maps that folded out, maps that showed countries and borders that don't exist anymore.
In the bathroom, the medicine cabinet held more than medicine. It was a catch-all, a place for Band-Aids and mercurochrome, a bottle of aspirin and a bottle of Pepto-Bismol, a thermometer in its little case, a tin of bag balm for chapped hands, a razor, and a package of blades that came wrapped in paper. There might have been a bottle of perfume in there, too, something your mother wore on special occasions, the scent floral and strong. The cabinet itself had a mirror on the door, and when you opened it, you saw yourself fragmented, multiplied in the mirrors inside. The shelves were narrow and metal, and things tended to fall out when you opened the door too quickly. The toothpaste, the dental floss, the little hotel soaps your mother collected and never used. Back in the kitchen, tucked into a drawer or sitting on a shelf in the pantry, there was probably a thermos bottle. Not the modern insulated travel mugs, but a proper thermos with a glass liner inside a metal or plastic shell, and a cap that doubled as a cup. Your father might have taken it to work with coffee in it, or you might have taken it on a road trip filled with lemonade or Kool-Aid. The thermos kept things hot or cold for hours, a small miracle of vacuum insulation, and it was fragile. If you dropped it, the glass liner inside would shatter, and you'd hear the pieces rattling around, and the thermos was ruined. But when it worked, it was magic. You'd open it at lunchtime, and the coffee from 6 o'clock in the morning was still steaming. That pantry, wherever it was, a closet in the kitchen, a cabinet, a whole separate room if you were lucky, held a different kind of abundance than you see now. There were staples bought in reasonable quantities and used up before they expired. Flour and sugar in canisters, maybe ceramic ones with labels painted on the side. A shelf of canned goods, vegetables, soup, fruit cocktail, and heavy syrup. Boxes of pasta and rice, a container of oatmeal, a jar of peanut butter, a jar of jam. Things were simple. You didn't have 15 varieties of pasta or 10 kinds of crackers. You had spaghetti and elbow macaroni. You had saltines. And you had enough, always enough, because your mother planned the meals for the week and bought what she needed, and she knew how to make it stretch. On the counter, or maybe on a shelf, there was probably a set of canisters, flour, sugar, coffee, tea, matching in whatever pattern your mother had chosen, roosters maybe, or mushrooms, or just simple stripes or polka dots. These canisters weren't airtight by modern standards, but they kept things dry and organized, and they added a touch of coordination to the kitchen, a sense that someone had thought about how things looked, not just how they functioned. Near the stove, there was probably a set of pot holders, thick quilted squares or mitts, often handmade, sometimes given as gifts. Your grandmother might have crocheted them, loops of cotton yarn in bright colors, dense enough to protect your hand from a hot pan. They hung on a hook or lived in a drawer, and they got singed and stained and washed and used again until they were too worn out to be safe, and then someone made or bought new ones. The stove itself was probably a big enameled thing, white or that same harvest gold or avocado green, with 4 burners and an oven below, and maybe a separate broiler drawer at the bottom. The knobs were simple, no digital displays, just off and low and high, and the numbers in between. The oven didn't have a timer that turned it off automatically. Your mother set a mechanical timer, the kind you twisted to the number of minutes you needed, and it ticked down and rang a bell when the time was up. Or she just glanced at the clock on the wall and remembered when she'd put the chicken in and calculated in her head when it would be done.
Next to the stove, on the counter, there might have been a set of canisters for cooking utensils, or just a ceramic container holding wooden spoons and spatulas, a whisk, a ladle, a slotted spoon. These were tools that lasted forever, that got handed down, that felt substantial in your hand. The wooden spoons wore down over time, the edges getting soft and gray from being stirred through thousands of pots of soup and sauce, and sometimes they'd crack, and you'd still use them because they worked, because they were familiar, because getting a new one seemed unnecessary. In the dining room, if your house had a separate dining room, there was probably a china cabinet. Not everyone used it every day, but it was there, a piece of furniture that displayed the good dishes, the ones with the delicate pattern, the ones that came out for Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter. The cabinet had glass doors and maybe a light inside, and the shelves were lined with paper or fabric, and the dishes sat there, protected, waiting for their moment. Below the glass doors, there might have been drawers for silverware, the real silver, the kind that needed to be polished, that came in a felt-lined box with specific slots for each piece. Using the good silver was an occasion. It meant someone was making an effort, that the meal mattered, that you were expected to be on your best behavior. The dining table itself was solid wood, probably, with chairs that matched, and maybe a leaf that could be inserted to make it longer when you had company. The table had a smell to it, wood and furniture polish, and if you ran your hand underneath, you might feel the texture of the grain, or find a piece of old gum that someone had stuck there decades ago. The table was where the family came together, not just for meals, but for homework, for games, for conversations that stretched late into the evening. It was the center of the home in a way that's hard to replicate now, when everyone eats at different times, in different rooms, staring at different screens. On the wall in the dining room or living room, there might have been a set of decorative plates, or a painting of a landscape or a sunset, or a mirror in an ornate frame. Decoration was deliberate, chosen carefully, and then it stayed. You didn't redecorate every few years. You lived with what you had, and it became part of the texture of your life, so familiar that you stopped seeing it until years later when you'd catch a glimpse of something similar in a thrift store or a photograph, and the memory would come flooding back. In the bedrooms, the furniture was heavy and meant to last. A bed with a wooden headboard and footboard, a dresser with a mirror attached, maybe a vanity table with a skirt around the bottom and a cushioned stool. The drawers of the dresser stuck sometimes, swollen with humidity, and you had to jiggle them just right to get them open.
Inside, your clothes were folded and stacked, not hung on hangers, but laid flat, and everything smelled faintly of the cedar blocks or mothballs your mother tucked in the corners to keep the moths away. On top of the dresser, there might have been a few personal items, a jewelry box that played a tinny tune when you opened it, a music box with a little ballerina that spun when you wound it up, a tray for cufflinks and tie clips, a bottle of cologne.
The bed itself had real weight to it. The mattress and box springs sat on a metal frame, and the whole thing was made up with sheets, a blanket, and a bedspread that matched the curtains. Some bedspreads were chenille, that nubby texture with a pattern you could feel with your fingers. Others were quilted, maybe handmade by a grandmother or great-grandmother, each square a different fabric, a scrap from a dress or a shirt, a patchwork of memories stitched together. You didn't just throw the covers back in the morning and leave them. You made the bed, pulling the sheets tight, tucking in the corners, smoothing the bedspread so it hung evenly on both sides. It was a task, a small piece of order imposed on the day. In the closet, clothes hung on wooden or wire hangers, and on the shelf above there might have been a hat box, or extra blankets, or a shoe box full of letters and postcards and other small treasures. The closet smelled like fabric and dust and the faint scent of whatever your mother used to freshen things, sachets of lavender maybe, or a bar of soap tucked in the corner. At the bottom of the closet, shoes were lined up, maybe on a rack, maybe just on the floor, and there probably weren't that many of them. A pair for church, a pair for every day, a pair for work, maybe sneakers for the kids. You wore them until they wore out, and then you got new ones, and the old ones were thrown away, or passed down, or saved for yard work. In the hallway, there was probably a linen closet, and it was stuffed full. Sheets and towels, of course, but also extra blankets for when guests stayed over, and probably some things that had no business being there. A stack of shopping bags saved for reuse, a box of old greeting cards, a collection of hotel toiletries, a flashlight that may or may not have working batteries. The linen closet was a catch-all, a place where things went to be stored and then forgotten, and every so often your mother would pull everything out, refold it, organize it, and put it back, and it would stay that way for a few weeks before the chaos crept back in. Near the front or back door, there was probably a mat for wiping your feet, and maybe a boot tray for wet or muddy shoes, and definitely an umbrella stand or a hook where umbrellas hung, dripping onto the floor after a rainstorm. The umbrella itself was probably a simple thing, black or dark blue, with a wooden handle and metal spokes, and it opened with a satisfying snap. It lived by the door so you could grab it on your way out if the sky looked threatening, and it spent most of its life folded up and forgotten, waiting for the next storm. On rainy afternoons, when you couldn't play outside, you might have found yourself sitting on the floor of your room with a board game or a deck of cards, or maybe a puzzle spread out on a card table that had been set up in the corner. The card table had folding legs and a surface covered in vinyl or some other wipeable material, and it wobbled if you leaned on it too hard, but it was perfect for games, for crafts, for any activity that needed a temporary surface. When you were done, the table folded up and went into a closet, flat and out of the way, until the next time you needed it.
The games themselves were in a hall closet or a cabinet somewhere, stacked in their boxes. Monopoly, Clue, Sorry, Parcheesi, checkers, chess, Scrabble. The boxes were worn at the corners, held together with tape, and some of the pieces were missing, replaced with improvised substitutes, a button standing in for a lost gain piece, a slip of paper for a missing card. But the games were played over and over on Sunday afternoons and during summer vacations, and they taught you patience and strategy and how to lose gracefully, or not so gracefully, depending on your temperament. In the garage or basement, if you had one, there was a whole other world. Your father's workbench with its pegboard on the wall where tools hung in neat rows. Hammers, screwdrivers, wrenches, pliers, each one outlined in marker so you knew where it belonged. There was a vise bolted to the edge of the bench, and maybe a coffee can full of screws and nails, sorted by size, or maybe just all mixed together. The smell of the garage was oil and sawdust and metal, and there was probably a lawnmower in the corner, and bicycles hanging from hooks on the wall, and a shelf with paint cans, some of them half full and dried out, the labels faded so you couldn't remember what room that color had been used in. In the basement, if you had one, there might have been a washer and dryer, the washer a top loader with an agitator in the middle that swished back and forth, and a wringer if you were in an older house, though those were disappearing by the 60s. The dryer was simple. You loaded the clothes, you set the timer, and you let it run. There was no moisture sensor, no delicate cycle, just heat and tumbling until the buzzer went off. The basement was also where extra things were stored, holiday decorations and cardboard boxes, old toys that no one played with anymore but couldn't quite be thrown away, canning jars if your mother or grandmother put up vegetables and fruit, a deep freeze if your family had one, stocked with meat and frozen vegetables and ice cream in big rectangular blocks that you'd scoop out with a spoon. The basement smelled like concrete and dampness, and it was cooler down there in the summer, a refuge from the heat. Some families finished part of the basement and turned it into a rec room with paneling on the walls and linoleum on the floor, and maybe a bar in the corner, and that's where the kids would hang out or where your father would retreat to watch a game on a second television, away from the rest of the family. Back upstairs in the bathroom, there was probably a scale, the kind you stepped on, and the needle would swing around to your weight, and it was never quite accurate, but you used it anyway. There was a bath mat, thick and absorbent, that got washed once a week and hung over the side of the tub to dry. The tub itself might have had a shower attachment, or it might have been just a tub, and if you wanted to wash your hair, you knelt down and leaned back and used a cup to pour water over your head. The faucets were simple, separate handles for hot and cold, and you adjusted them until the temperature was right. And sometimes it took a while for the hot water to arrive, so you let it run and waited.
The bathroom cabinet, in addition to the medicine, probably held a stack of washcloths and hand towels and maybe a bar of soap in a dish, the kind of soap that came in a box wrapped in paper, soap that actually smelled like soap, not like lavender fields or tropical fruit. There was probably a toothbrush holder on the sink and toothpaste in a tube that you squeezed from the bottom and rolled up as it emptied, and dental floss in a little dispenser, and maybe a bottle of mouthwash that stung when you used it but left your mouth feeling clean. In the hall closet or a closet in one of the bedrooms, there was probably a vacuum cleaner, a heavy upright model, maybe a Hoover, with a cloth bag that filled with dust and had to be emptied outside, a cloud of dirt and hair shaken loose into the trash can. The vacuum had one speed, one setting, and it was loud, so loud that you couldn't hear anything else when it was running, and it smelled like hot dust and rubber. Vacuuming was a chore that happened on a schedule, once a week at least, more often in high-traffic areas, and when it was done, the house smelled clean, the carpets had those vacuum tracks, and everything felt a little more in order. On the kitchen windowsill, there might have been a small collection of plants, an African violet maybe, or a spider plant with its long shoots and baby plantlets hanging down, or a pot of herbs that your mother used for cooking. The plants were cared for casually, watered when they looked dry, given a little sunlight, and they grew where they didn't, and if they died, they were replaced. There was no app to remind you to water them, no moisture meter. You just paid attention or you didn't, and the plant let you know. On the counter near the toaster, there might have been a bread box, a metal container with a roll-up door or a hinged lid where bread was kept to stay fresh.
The bread itself probably came from the grocery store in a plastic bag, sliced and soft, or maybe from a bakery if you were lucky, a whole loaf that had to be cut with a serrated knife. The bread box kept it from getting stale too quickly, though it would still get stale eventually, and then it became toast or breadcrumbs or stuffing. Nothing was wasted. Next to the stove or in a drawer, there was probably a box of matches, the kind with the striking strip on the side, and you used them to light the burners if your stove didn't have automatic ignition, or to light candles, or to start a fire in the fireplace if you had one. The smell of a struck match was sulfur and wood, sharp and then quickly fading, and you learned to blow it out just as the flame reached your fingers. There might have been a lighter, too, one of those metal ones that flipped open and sparked when you rolled the wheel with your thumb, and it needed to be refilled with lighter fluid every so often, a process that involved pouring the fluid into the bottom and waiting for it to soak into the cotton inside. On the kitchen table or on a shelf, there was probably a sugar bowl and a creamer, part of a set, maybe ceramic or glass, used when company came over for coffee. The sugar bowl had a lid and a little spoon, and the sugar inside was granulated white sugar, not the fancy raw sugar or the packets of artificial sweetener, just plain sugar that you spooned into your coffee or tea and stirred until it dissolved. The creamer held milk or actual cream, poured from a bottle, and it sat on the table while people drank their coffee, and afterward it went back in the refrigerator.
Somewhere in the house, probably in a drawer in the kitchen or the living room, there was a collection of odd small things that didn't have another home. Rubber bands and a tangled ball, twist ties from bread bags, a pencil with no eraser, a couple of keys that no one could remember what they unlocked, a promotional pen from the bank, a coupon clipped from the newspaper that expired last month, a button that came off something and was saved just in case, a safety pin, a paper clip. These drawers were a kind of domestic junk drawer, and everyone had one, and you could find almost anything in there if you dug long enough. On the back porch or in the garage, there might have been a cooler, the kind you filled with ice for picnics and trips to the beach. It was heavy-duty plastic or metal with a handle on each end, and when you opened it, the smell of old ice and dampness would hit you. You'd pack it with sandwiches and cans of soda, and the ice would melt over the course of the day, and by the time you got home, everything would be floating in cold water, and you'd have to tip it over to drain it out. In the living room or den, there might have been a magazine rack, a metal or wooden stand that held the latest issues of Life, or Look, or Reader's Digest, or TV Guide with its tiny print listing every show for the week. Your father might have subscribed to Popular Mechanics or National Geographic, and those would pile up until someone decided to throw out the old ones or take him to the doctor's office for the waiting room. The magazines were glossy and colorful, full of advertisements that are fascinating now for what they reveal about the time, the cars, the clothes, the assumptions about who was doing the cooking and the cleaning. On a side table, there might have been a candy dish filled with hard candies or mints, the kind your grandmother always had, and you were allowed to take one when you visited, and it would last forever in your mouth, sweet and slow to dissolve. Or there might have been a dish of nuts, still in the shell, with a nutcracker nearby, and cracking them open was a small entertainment, a way to keep your hands busy while you talked or watched television. If you went door to door in that neighborhood, you might have encountered salesmen, men usually, with cases full of samples, selling vacuum cleaners or encyclopedias or brushes or insurance. They'd knock on the door, and your mother would answer, and sometimes she'd let 'em in to give their pitch, and sometimes she'd politely decline, and they'd move on to the next house. It was just part of the rhythm of the week. Someone was always selling something, and people were polite about it, even if they had no intention of buying. The neighborhood itself felt different. People knew each other, not because they were on a community app, but because they saw each other. They talked over the fence while hanging laundry or mowing the lawn. They borrowed a cup of sugar or a tool. They kept an eye on each other's houses when someone was on vacation.
There was a sense of mutual responsibility, of looking out for one another that didn't require technology or organization. It just was. And at night, when the day was over, your father would go around the house and check the locks on the doors, turn off the lights, make sure the porch light was on. You'd brush your teeth, put on your pajamas, and get into bed, and your mother might come in to say goodnight, to pull the covers up, to turn off the lamp on your nightstand. The house would settle into its nighttime sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of wood as the temperature changed. Outside, the street lights would glow, and the neighborhood would be quiet, and you'd fall asleep in a house that felt safe and solid and unchanging, surrounded by things that had been there yesterday and would be there tomorrow, ordinary objects that made up the fabric of a life that seemed, at the time, like it would go on forever.